The day he first laid eyes on the old property, it was nothing more than a whisper of what it had once been. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the weathered fences and cracked barns. Tall grass pressed against his boots, hiding broken boards and rusted tools, and the air smelled faintly of hay, dust, and something older, something forgotten. He had been searching for a place to start fresh, a quiet corner where he could dedicate himself to something meaningful. When he saw the for sale sign swinging in the breeze, he felt a tug he couldn't explain. There was a stillness here, a sense of life paused in time, like the property had been waiting for someone who cared enough to breathe it back to life. As he walked through the main barn, he noticed the smell of horse leather and feed lingering faintly in the air, even though it had been abandoned for years. Empty stalls stared back at him, their wood splintered, the metal rings rusted from neglect. He imagined the horses that must have once called this place home, their soft nickers and restless hoofbeats echoing in his mind. The barn held secrets, that much was clear, though the full story lay buried beneath years of silence and dust. The more he explored, the more he felt drawn deeper into the past, as if the property itself were whispering to him, urging him to uncover what had been left behind. It was in the corner of the tack room where he first found something unusual. A small chest, tucked behind a leaning saddle stand, almost hidden from sight. Its latch was stiff, protesting as he pried it open, and inside lay a collection of halters, 43 of them, neatly stacked, each tagged with a name written in careful, looping script. At first they seemed like relics, tokens from horses long gone, perhaps a sentimental collection from someone who had once loved this place deeply. But the longer he looked, the more he felt an unease creeping over him. Some of the tags were smudged or torn, others bore marks of carelessness, as if someone had been hurried, hiding them away rather than preserving them. He couldn't shake the feeling that these halters were more than just old gear. There was a story here, something hidden behind the neat rows of leather and brass. He ran his fingers along the straps, feeling the grooves of years etched into the material, and imagined the hands that had fastened them onto the muzzles of horses that had long since vanished. Why had no one come back for them? Why had the property been left to rot? Each halter seemed to hum with a memory, a quiet insistence that demanded to be heard. And somewhere in the shadows of the barn, he felt eyes on him, not human eyes, but the lingering presence of all that had passed through this place. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boards against each other and carrying the faint scent of rain. The property was larger than he had imagined, with rolling pastures that had grown wild and unkempt. He could see remnants of old fences, broken in places, and patches of earth where the horses must have grazed. The pond at the far end shimmered under the cloudy sky, and he felt a sudden pang of longing. This could be a sanctuary, a place to save animals and rebuild life. But the quiet weight of the past clung to everything, and with each step he felt the shadow of untold stories pressing in. He met the caretaker on his second day, a grizzled man who had stayed on after the property had been abandoned, feeding the remaining animals and keeping the worst of the decay at bay. He spoke little, his eyes carrying a memory that seemed too heavy to share. He warned the new owner about the quirks of the place, the creaking stalls, the hidden water leaks, the stubborn gates that refused to open without protest. But when he mentioned the halters, he hesitated, his voice dropping low. "Some things," he said, "you don't want to know right away. Best take it slow, or it'll eat at you." That warning, far from deterring him, only sharpened the new owner's curiosity. There was a story here, buried under layers of dust and silence, and he was determined to uncover it. Over the next few days, he catalogued the halters, noting each name, tracing the wear patterns, and trying to piece together a timeline. Some were old and cracked, leather fraying at the edges, while others were surprisingly well kept, almost as if they had been hidden carefully rather than forgotten. As he worked, he discovered small notes tucked inside a few of the halters' handwritten scraps mentioning dates, brief descriptions of the horses, sometimes just a single word like gone or lost. Each note added a layer of mystery, making him wonder about the fate of the animals and the people who had cared for them. Why were these halters left behind? And why, after all these years, did the story feel like it was waiting for him to piece it together? Nights in the old barn were the hardest. The silence pressed in, heavy and unbroken, save for the occasional creak of wood or the distant call of an owl. He would lie awake listening to the wind whisper through the broken windows, imagining shadows shifting in the corners, the faint impression of hooves that weren't there. Sometimes he felt the chill of being watched, though no one was around, and the halters seemed to gleam faintly in the moonlight, almost as if they were alive with the memories of the past. Every night the questions grew louder, more insistent, demanding answers that the property refused to give. Then, on a morning heavy with fog, he found something new. One of the halters had been moved. He was certain of it. It wasn't just the position. The strap bore marks of fresh handling, and a note had been slipped inside that he swore he hadn't seen before. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the message was cryptic. Some truths are darker than you know. Follow the path, but don't awaken what sleeps. He felt a chill run down his spine, his pulse quickening. The quiet curiosity that had drawn him here was now mingled with fear. There was more to this place than abandonment and memory. There was a secret, hidden and patient, waiting to be discovered. As he stared at the halter in his hands, the barn around him seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Outside, the fog thickened, muting the world beyond the property line. The land that had once seemed so promising now felt like the threshold to something unknown, something that had been buried long before he arrived. He could feel it in his bones, the promise of renewal, the pull of hope, and the weight of whatever dark story had been left behind in these 43 halters. He knew that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy. Each step forward felt like walking further into a story he wasn't entirely ready to read, a past that refused to stay silent. And yet the pull was irresistible. He had come here to save horses, to rebuild, to start anew, but now, with every halter he examined, the line between hope and danger blurred. Somewhere in the depths of this abandoned property, a secret waited, one that could change everything he thought he knew about the place, and perhaps himself. The fog clung tighter to the pastures as he stepped outside, the wind whispering through the trees like the echo of long-forgotten voices. He glanced back at the barn, at the rows of halters stacked neatly in the corner, and for the first time he felt that the property had chosen him for a reason. He wasn't just here to restore what was lost, he was here to uncover what had been hidden, to confront the darkness that lingered quietly behind the walls of the abandoned horse rescue center. And as he reached for the first halter to begin again, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting to be revealed was only just beginning to stir. The barn doors creaked shut behind him, and the wind howled through the empty stalls. 43 halters sat in silence, each one a marker of a story untold, a secret poised to emerge. And somewhere in the shadows, something or someone watched, waiting for him to take the next step. The morning after he found the mysterious note, the fog lingered longer than usual, draping the pastures in a pale gray silence that seemed almost alive. He could barely see the edges of the property, and the barn loomed in the mist like a monument to forgotten memories. There was an eerie calm in the air, the kind that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. He tried to shake it off as imagination, but every instinct in him whispered that the property had more to reveal, and it wasn't done yet. He spent the day walking the grounds, trying to get a sense of the land. Broken fences crisscrossed the fields, leaning unevenly from years of neglect. Wildflowers grew in patches where grass once stood neatly trimmed, and the pond at the edge of the property shimmered under the weak sunlight, almost too still, too perfect. He imagined horses moving through these pastures, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust, the sound of their neighs echoing across the open land. The thought made him ache with a strange longing. This had been a place full of life, and he had stepped into it at the very moment it was poised between death and revival. Inside the barn, the halters seemed to demand his attention. He had organized them by the names on their tags, but there was no apparent order beyond that. Some names were common, others unusual, almost poetic, and each carried a weight he couldn't place. He flipped through the notes he had found, trying to make sense of the sparse details. A few mentioned illnesses, others hinted at accidents, and some simply recorded dates and nothing more. Yet there was a pattern he couldn't ignore, a sense of urgency buried in the handwriting, a hurriedness that suggested someone had been trying to preserve memories quickly, almost in fear. The caretaker's warning echoed in his mind. Some things you don't want to know right away. He had brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the superstition of an old man clinging to the past. But now, as he looked at the halters and their fragile notes, he realized the man had been more serious than he'd imagined. The history of the property wasn't just about abandonment or neglect. Something had happened here, something that had left an imprint so heavy it lingered even after the people had gone. Curiosity pushed him to dig deeper. He found a ledger hidden in a dusty corner of the tack room, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was a record of horses' names, dates, and occasionally brief descriptions. Most entries were straightforward, like star arrived March 14th, 08 healthy, but some ended abruptly, marked with a single word, gone. He flipped page after page, the pattern unsettling. Over time, the word gone appeared more frequently, sometimes multiple times in a row, as if the ledger were documenting a series of losses he couldn't yet understand. The handwriting changed slightly with each entry, indicating multiple people may have been involved in maintaining the records. He couldn't tell whether it was carelessness or something more deliberate. Outside the barn, the wind carried the faint sound of creaking boards and rustling leaves. He paused, imagining shadows moving just beyond his vision. Every step across the uneven ground seemed to awaken the property, stirring whispers of the past he couldn't yet hear clearly. The caretaker had mentioned that some areas were dangerous, weak boards and hidden holes that could catch a horse or a person off guard. He wondered if the danger was more than physical. Perhaps the property itself held a kind of memory, a lingering weight that pressed on anyone who came close enough to notice. He returned to the barn that evening, lantern in hand, the light flickering against the weathered walls. He spread the halters across the floor, examining each one in detail. The leather varied in texture and color, some stiff and cracked, others surprisingly supple. Buckles bore different markings, some polished to a dull shine, others corroded and pitted by years of neglect. He noticed faint stains on a few, subtle enough that they could have been anything, but together they added a layer of unease. Each halter was a fragment of a story, and each fragment seemed to point toward a truth the property wasn't ready to reveal. He felt compelled to know more about the previous owner, the person who had tended to these horses before the property fell into ruin. Through old records and local whispers, he discovered that the farm had been run by a family for generations. They had been respected in the community, known for their love of horses and dedication to animal rescue. But something had changed over time. Rumors of misfortune circulated, disappearances of horses, sudden closures, unexplained absences, and the property had eventually been abandoned without explanation. There were gaps in the story, long stretches of time where no one knew what had happened, and the halters now felt like breadcrumbs left behind, waiting for someone to follow the trail. One afternoon, while exploring an overgrown path behind the barn, he stumbled upon a small grave marker, partially hidden by vines and moss. It was unassuming, just a simple stone with initials carved into it, but its presence made his stomach tighten. Nearby, the earth had settled in a way that suggested more graves might be hidden beneath the surface. He felt the weight of years pressing down, a silent accusation that these past losses were not entirely gone. They lingered, waiting for acknowledgement. The fog rolling over the fields seemed heavier here, clinging to the ground like a shroud, and he wondered what else might lie buried in the soil or in the memories of the barn. He began spending more time in the local town, asking questions about the property, the family who had run it, and the animals that had lived there. Some townsfolk were helpful, sharing fragmented recollections of the farm's heyday, of horses with names that matched the halters, of competitions won and losses mourned. Others grew tight-lipped, their eyes flicking toward the horizon as if the mention of the property itself summoned something they wished to forget. He sensed that the truth was known to some, feared by many, and ignored by most. Yet every piece of information only deepened the mystery, pulling him further into a story that had been left unfinished. Nights became restless. He often found himself standing in the barn under the dim glow of the lantern, staring at the halters and tracing the names with his fingertips. Sometimes he thought he could hear faint noises, soft snorts, the shuffle of hooves, or the whisper of leather brushing against wood. He would turn quickly, expecting to see a horse or the caretaker, or even someone else, but the stalls were empty, save for the ghosts of memory. Sleep was thin and fleeting, filled with dreams of horses he had never seen, of voices that whispered warnings he could not yet understand. The property had a rhythm of its own, and he was slowly learning to listen. One evening he returned to the barn to find one halter missing. His heart raced, and a chill ran through him. The halter was one of the older ones, worn and cracked, and now it was gone. He searched the stalls, the tack room, even the overgrown yard outside. Nothing. It was as if the halter had simply vanished. And yet the feeling of being watched intensified, as though the property had noticed his investigation and was responding. A faint scuff mark in the dust suggested recent movement, deliberate and quiet. Whoever or whatever was here had left no trace, and the absence of the halter was a silent message he couldn't yet decipher. Determined to press on, he began piecing together the halters with the ledger and the notes he had found. Patterns emerged slowly, horses that had arrived together, dates that overlapped, sudden gaps in the records that coincided with the word gone. Some halters had additional markings, almost like tally marks or faint scratches near the buckles. They were subtle, easy to overlook, but now they seemed like clues pointing to a truth he could almost grasp. The property had a story, and the halters were the key. But every discovery brought more questions than answers, leaving him on the edge of understanding without ever fully stepping into it. The caretaker's words haunted him more than ever. Best take it slow, or it'll eat at you. He now understood that the warning was not about the physical dangers of the property, but about the weight of its history. Each halter, each note, each ledger entry carried more than memory, it carried consequence, a silent legacy of choices and losses that refused to remain buried. And the property seemed to sense his persistence, the way the shadows deepened in corners he had not yet explored, the way the wind seemed to respond to his presence, stirring leaves and dust as if guiding him somewhere. By the time he closed the barn that night, the fog had thickened to a near impenetrable curtain, and the air carried a damp chill that settled into his bones. He glanced once more at the empty stalls, at the rows of halters stacked neatly in the corner, and felt the unmistakable pull of something waiting to reveal itself. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in the story of the property, drawn into its past and bound to its future. And as the wind whispered through the broken boards, he knew with certainty that the next discovery could change everything, though whether it would bring understanding, danger, or both, he could not yet say. The lantern flickered low in the dark, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. 43 halters remained, each one a silent witness to secrets he had not yet uncovered. The missing halter, the cryptic note, the ledger filled with abrupt endings, all of it pressed on his mind like the weight of history itself. Somewhere within the barn, and perhaps within the property as a whole, the truth waited. But it would not come easily, and it would not reveal itself without demand. As he stepped outside, the fog closing behind him like a living wall, he realized that he was standing on the edge of something far greater than he had imagined. The mystery of the abandoned horse rescue center was only beginning to unfold, and he was caught in the center of its quiet, relentless pull. The days blurred together as he immersed himself deeper into the mysteries of the property. Every morning he would rise to the misty fields, feeling the damp chill seep through his clothes, and walk past the empty stalls, imagining what life had been like when the barn was filled with horses. Each halter he examined seemed to pull him further into the past, and the ledger became a map, a fragmented record of the lives that had passed through this place. Some names repeated, others vanished, and with every discovery, the unease that had been creeping through him thickened like fog settling over the pastures. The caretaker became a more reluctant companion, appearing at odd hours with the air of someone carrying a secret too heavy to speak aloud. Sometimes he would linger silently, fixing a fence or checking the water troughs, but his eyes often flicked toward the halters as if they held a truth that even he feared to confront. When asked about the missing halter, the caretaker's face tightened, and he muttered only that some things get moved when the wrong eyes are watching. The words sent a shiver through him, and he realized that there was more at play here than just abandoned property and forgotten horses. The farm had a hidden rhythm, one that could not be fully understood without paying attention to the small, almost imperceptible signs left behind. One afternoon he discovered a hidden compartment in the tack room, behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside were papers, letters mostly yellowed and brittle, some with ink smudged from time or moisture. They were addressed to no one, yet they spoke in urgent tones about the farm's operations, the horses, and more strangely, the behavior of some of the staff who had come and gone. There were mentions of missing animals and of records not to be questioned, hints at a pattern he didn't yet understand. It painted a picture of a farm that had once been orderly and caring, but one where shadowy decisions were made in quiet corners. Each letter added layers to the mystery, suggesting that the darkness hinted at in the halters was not accidental, it had been deliberate. Meanwhile, he began noticing small disturbances around the property that couldn't be explained. Footprints in the mud that didn't match his own, a gate swinging open in the middle of the night, the faint scent of leather and hay lingering longer than it should. He considered the possibility of an intruder, but the disturbances were subtle, almost ceremonial, as if the property itself had a way of communicating that he wasn't supposed to ignore. Every detail felt like a warning. The missing halter, the cryptic note, and now these small signs, they were all part of a puzzle whose edges he could almost feel, but never quite see. He also began keeping a journal, documenting the halters, the letters, the ledger entries, and every unusual occurrence. As the days passed, patterns emerged. Certain names recurred in both the ledger and letters, and their associated dates often coincided with strange events in the town's history: fires, illnesses, and disappearances. He visited the local library and historical society, piecing together old newspaper clippings and property records. Slowly, it became clear that the farm story was woven into the history of the town itself, a hidden thread of secrets that few were willing to acknowledge. The halters were more than tokens. They were markers of events that had left a mark on both animals and humans alike. Tension built as he began to interact more with the townspeople. Some were helpful, recalling stories of horses with unusual temperaments, of trainers and caretakers who vanished without explanation, and of competitions where prizes were won under suspicious circumstances. Others grew defensive when he mentioned the property, their eyes narrowing, their voices quieting. He sensed unspoken rules lines not to cross, and it only intensified his desire to uncover the truth. The property and the halters had become a magnet, pulling not only him but the past itself forward, forcing him to confront questions that had long been buried. He started noticing subtle differences in the barn depending on the time of day or weather. Morning light revealed small scratches on the stalls that were invisible in the evening. Rain brought a pungent mix of wet leather and moss, carrying with it the faint impression of movement just beyond the reach of his vision. It was as if the property was alive in ways that didn't make sense, responding to him, warning him, or guiding him. The halters, too, seemed to shift imperceptibly. Their arrangement sometimes changed, small differences he couldn't attribute to wind or his own movement. It became increasingly difficult to separate imagination from reality, and yet he couldn't turn away. One evening, while sorting through the letters again, he found a note that chilled him more than any other. It spoke of a horse that had gone missing under suspicious circumstances, a horse named for one of the halters he had found. The letter implied that someone had acted out of fear or desperation, and that the consequences were being deliberately concealed. He began to connect the dots, the halters, the ledger, the letters, the missing halter, and now the local rumors. There was a story of concealment, of choices made quietly, of secrets that could not be spoken aloud without consequences. And somehow he was being drawn into it. The caretaker seemed increasingly wary of him, though he continued performing his duties around the property. One evening he pulled him aside and said, "You're poking at things better left alone. This place has seen more than you think, and it has ways of reminding people to respect that. Some stories, they wait for the right time, and some, they wait for no one." The ambiguity of the warning only fueled his determination. He realized that uncovering the farm's secrets might not only reveal the truth about the horses and the halters, but also about the people who had lived and worked there, including the caretaker himself. Subplots began emerging in unexpected ways. While he focused on the property, he became aware of his own growing isolation. Townsfolk who once smiled now watched silently. Children whispered and ran past him when he walked through the streets, and even the postman seemed hesitant to approach the barn. It was as though the property's shadow extended beyond its fences, touching the lives of everyone connected to it. Meanwhile, a sense of responsibility to the horses that might still remain either physically or in memory pressured him to continue, even as unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. One night, a storm rolled in with sudden intensity. Rain lashed against the roof of the barn, wind bending the trees in the pastures, and the lantern flickered violently in his hands. He moved quickly to secure the stalls, his mind on the halters and ledger entries. As he crossed the tack room, a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision, something moving faster than he could track. He froze, heart pounding, and then saw it again, a figure crouched low, almost blending into the darkness, vanishing as soon as he looked directly. It left no footprints, no sign of entry or exit. Yet the missing halter flashed in his memory, and he felt certain that whatever he was glimpsing was connected. The property was no longer just a place. It was a stage, and he had stepped onto it. Days passed with subtle, mounting tension. Items went missing, letters appeared that he didn't remember placing, and certain halters bore marks that weren't there before. The boundaries between past and present blurred. Sometimes he thought he heard whispers in the barn, murmurs of conversations that had taken place decades earlier. He began speaking to himself as a way to anchor his mind, reading aloud the ledger and letters to maintain a sense of control. But the property resisted that control, pushing him toward discoveries he wasn't yet ready to face. Then, late one evening, he found a series of footprints leading from the barn to the edge of the pasture. They were small, almost delicate, and impossible to trace to a horse or a human. The tracks vanished into the mist near the pond, where the water was smooth and undisturbed. The discovery left him shaken, wondering whether the property was actively resisting his intrusion, or if there was someone or something watching and guiding him from the shadows. The halters, the ledger, the letters, and the caretaker's warnings all seemed to converge into a single, unspoken truth. The farm's story was alive, and it demanded to be understood on its own terms. He spent hours staring at the halters, running through every name, every note, every mark, trying to reconstruct the hidden history. Yet each connection he made opened new questions. Why were certain horses marked gone? What had happened to the missing halter? Were the disturbances the work of a living person or echoes of the past itself? The deeper he delved, the more the property resisted, as though testing his resolve. And still he could not leave. The abandoned horse rescue center had chosen him, not simply as an owner, but as a witness and a participant. 43 halters waited, each one a marker of stories that refused to die. And somewhere in the shadows, a presence lingered, watching him, guiding him, challenging him to uncover what had been hidden. The conflict was no longer just about restoration or discovery. It was a struggle to understand the full weight of the property's memory, to navigate the tangled web of past decisions, and to survive the truths that waited in the dark. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded the barn roof like a drum, as if urging him forward. He held a halter in his hands, tracing the worn leather and faded markings, feeling the pulse of history beneath his fingertips. The story of the abandoned horse rescue center was unfolding, but not on his terms. It was an active, living mystery, one that refused to be neatly solved or easily understood. And as the lantern flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, he knew with certainty that the next discovery could change everything. And yet, the full truth remained just out of reach, waiting in the darkness beyond his vision. The nights grew longer and heavier as he sank further into the history of the property. The wind had taken on a different tone, sharper and more insistent, rattling the barn doors and carrying faint echoes that he couldn't place. Each morning he found subtle changes, halters slightly shifted, letters moved, footprints appearing in the mud where there had been none the night before. He began to suspect that the property itself had memory, a consciousness that both resisted and revealed in equal measure. It was no longer simply a place to restore. It had become a puzzle, a living entity with secrets it would not freely give. He spent hours at the local library, digging through microfilm and old newspaper clippings. Every record he found added weight to the mystery. There had been reports of horses disappearing under odd circumstances, barn fires that were never fully explained, and caretakers who left abruptly, their reasons never made public. The townspeople who remembered these events spoke cautiously, their voices low and wary, as if even speaking of the property aloud might summon its past. It became clear that the abandoned rescue center had been a place of both care and hidden danger, a duality reflected in the halters and ledger entries he now studied obsessively. Inside the barn, tension seemed to hang in the air. The halters, arranged meticulously on the tackroom floor, were more than mere objects. They felt like markers, pieces of a story he was slowly uncovering. Some bore faint scratches, almost imperceptible. Others seemed newer than the rest, as if someone or something had handled them recently. The missing halter haunted him more than anything. Its absence was a silent accusation, a puzzle piece deliberately removed. He could feel the presence of whatever had taken it, whether human or something else, lurking just out of reach, watching, waiting. The caretaker grew quieter with each passing day. When he appeared, his eyes lingered on the halters longer than necessary, and sometimes he would mutter to himself, shaking his head. Some stories have claws, he said once, almost to no one, before disappearing into the fog that hugged the property. The words lingered in the air like a threat or a warning. The more he uncovered, the more he realized the caretaker knew far more than he had ever shared. And yet, the old man offered no guidance beyond cryptic remarks, leaving him to navigate the escalating tension alone. Then came the first truly strange incident. Late one night during a storm, he awoke to the sound of movement in the barn. Heavy rain pounded the roof, masking other noises, but he could hear it, the faint shuffle of hooves on the wooden floor, slow, deliberate. He grabbed his lantern and rushed to the barn, but the stalls were empty. The halters were still arranged in their corner, except for one another missing halter this time. His heart raced and he felt a chill crawl down his spine. The storm outside seemed to respond, the wind lashing against the building as if to warn him off. He couldn't tell if what he was witnessing was supernatural, the work of someone else, or a trick of his own mind, but the fear it stirred was undeniable. Over the following days he became increasingly vigilant. He checked every stall, examined the halters repeatedly, and kept the ledger and letters close at hand. Even the smallest details took on enormous significance. A scratch on the wood here, a footprint there, a note tucked under a halter that he swore hadn't been there the day before. He began documenting everything meticulously, trying to make sense of the patterns. He noticed clusters of dates on the ledger corresponding with missing halters and letters, warning of accidents or disappearances. The property's past and present were colliding, and he realized he was being pulled into a story he could no longer observe from a safe distance. The tension extended beyond the barn. While exploring the fields one afternoon, he came across a cluster of overgrown stalls at the far end of the property. These were older than the main barn, their wood rotted and leaning precariously. As he approached, he noticed faint impressions in the mud hoofprints and footprints that led from the stalls to the tree line. They didn't match any animal or human he had seen before, and they seemed too deliberate to be natural. The feeling of being watched intensified, and he sensed that the property was guiding him toward something, whether as a warning or an invitation he could not refuse. His interactions with the townspeople grew more complicated. One local, an elderly woman who had lived near the property all her life, warned him in hushed tones. "That place, it has a memory," she said, wringing her hands. "It remembers everything done within its fences. Some things aren't meant to be uncovered. You'll see." If you're not careful, her warning did little to dissuade him. Instead, it amplified his obsession. He felt compelled to understand the history of the halters, the ledger, and the letters. Every person who spoke hesitantly only confirmed that he was on the edge of a revelation no one had dared confront. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he noticed movement near the pond. Something or someone slipped through the mist with unnatural silence. Lantern in hand, he followed cautiously, heart pounding, until the shape vanished behind a grove of trees. When he returned to the barn, the halters had shifted again. He counted them carefully, 41 now, 2 missing. His pulse quickened. He realized that the property was reacting to him, testing him, revealing and concealing in ways he could barely comprehend. Sleep became elusive. He dreamt of horses that had never existed, of shadows moving through the barn, and of halters strung across the pastures like warning signs. Each dream carried pieces of the truth, though always distorted, always incomplete. He awoke with a tight knot in his chest, compelled to act on the fragments his subconscious offered. The boundaries between waking and dreaming blurred, and the property seemed to thrive in that uncertainty, its secrets pressing on him with every passing hour. The caretaker finally spoke more openly one evening, though his words were careful, measured. "There are things in this place you'll find. Things that shouldn't be handled carelessly. The halters! They mark the past, but they also warn of the present. Whoever owned this place before. They left instructions, though most didn't understand them. Some of those horses were never just animals, they were part of something larger." He paused, eyes fixed on the corner where the halters sat. "If you're going to finish this story, you'll need more than courage. You'll need patience, and you'll need to accept that some truths hurt." The intensity reached a new level when he discovered a small, hidden stable behind the main barn. Its door had been nailed shut, and the wood was darker, almost blackened with age. Inside, he found signs of recent activity, straw freshly disturbed, small hoofprints in the dirt, and one halter lying on the ground, unmistakably familiar. It was the first halter that had gone missing. He felt a mixture of relief and dread. The property had given him a clue, but it had done so in a way that heightened the tension. He could feel the unseen presence nearby, watching, guiding, or waiting. Every instinct told him that he was on the cusp of uncovering the full story, and that the climax of the property's secret was approaching. He began piecing together the final connections. Ledger entries, halters, letters, and subtle signs across the property all seemed to point toward a single event, a hidden moment in the history of the farm that had left a shadow over everything. The pattern was undeniable. Horses marked gone correlated with letters warning of accidents, disappearances, or mismanagement, and these corresponded to dates when the property had been most active with caretakers and staff who were no longer present. He sensed that the answers lay not just in the objects themselves, but in the spaces between them, in the empty stalls, the hidden stable, and the shadowed corners where history lingered. Then came the night that changed everything. A thick fog rolled over the property, heavier than he had ever seen, muting all sound except the occasional crash of a tree branch against the barn roof. He moved through the barn, lantern in hand, feeling the oppressive weight of history pressing down. Halters shifted again, small noises echoed in the corners, and the missing halters seemed to hum with presence. He sensed something closing in, something tangible yet impossible to define. The air was charged, as if the property itself had drawn a line in the dust, signaling that the revelation was near, and that the tension he had felt building for weeks was about to erupt into clarity. Footsteps, or were they hoofbeats? Echoed faintly in the distance, growing closer. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the faint smell of leather and hay thickened into something more pungent, almost electric. The wind carried whispers, indecipherable but urgent, and the halters seemed to vibrate with energy. He gripped the lantern tighter, his pulse racing, knowing that he was on the edge of the climax, a moment where all the secrets, the missing halters, the ledger, the letters, the caretaker's warnings, and the presence he had felt for weeks would converge. Every instinct screamed that the revelation was imminent, and that whatever awaited him would demand courage he had never known he possessed. The barn seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing closer, the shadows deepening. One halter, impossibly, lifted slightly from the floor, as if moved by an invisible hand. The sound of distant water from the pond, the wind in the trees, the faint creak of the roof, all combined into a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. He stepped forward, lantern trembling, feeling the culmination of weeks of discovery, fear, and obsession press down on him. The property had drawn him here, to this precise moment, and he knew that beyond the next threshold, the truth or something resembling it was waiting to reveal itself. He took a breath, trying to steady his mind, and stepped deeper into the barn, toward the corner where the halters lay. The air was thick, charged with tension, and the faint impression of movement surrounded him. He could feel the weight of history, of lives lost and hidden, pressing in from every side. Every discovery, every missing halter, every warning, every shadow had led to this moment. He was poised on the edge, and the climax of the property's secret was about to erupt. He stood frozen in the barn, the lantern casting trembling light across the halters stacked in the corner. The air felt electric, alive with the weight of everything that had come before the missing halters, the ledger entries, the letters, and the whispers of the property itself. He took a careful step forward, feeling the soft crunch of dust beneath his boots, and the shadows seemed to shift as though drawing him closer to the truth. The barn had always been silent, but now it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the moment that had been building for weeks. As he reached the corner where the halters had been, he noticed that all 43 were there now. The missing ones had returned, arranged neatly as though someone or something had put them back. His pulse slowed slightly, though the tension in the air remained thick. Each halter carried a story, a memory, and together they formed a map of the property's past. The realization hit him. These halters were more than reminders of horses. They were markers of lives, choices, and secrets that had been buried but never forgotten. He began examining them one by one, carefully reading the names and notes tucked inside. Slowly, a story emerged, one of care and compassion, but also of mistakes and hidden consequences. Some horses had been lost to illness or injury, others had disappeared under circumstances that the previous owners had feared revealing. The ledger and letters had been the only attempt to preserve the truth, to honor what had been lost while protecting the reputation of those who had run the farm. Now, in the quiet of the barn, he felt as though the past had entrusted him with the final act to acknowledge the history fully and allow it to rest. The caretaker watched quietly from the doorway, his eyes softer now, almost relieved. "It's all here," he said finally. "Everything that happened, every choice made, it's all in these halters. You've seen it, and that's the important part. The property doesn't hide from those who are willing to understand." He stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on the old wood of the barn. "Some of us spend our lives trying to forget. You've done what no one else could. You've remembered." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the pastures glistening under the early morning sun. The pond reflected the sky like a mirror, calm and unbroken, and for the first time, he noticed the subtle beauty of the land beyond the shadows and mystery. The barn, once oppressive and heavy with silence, now felt like a space of transition, a place where history could finally breathe. He realized that the property had been testing him, not to frighten or punish, but to ensure that the story was treated with care and understanding. He turned his attention to the small hidden stable behind the barn. The halters that had reappeared there suggested a final lesson. The farm's past was not meant to be feared, but to be honored. He walked through the stable slowly, inspecting the stalls and the ground beneath them. In one corner, he found a faded photograph tucked between the boards, an image of a young caretaker with a group of horses, smiling with pride and affection. He recognized some of the names from the halters. The photograph connected the dots in a way that the ledger, letters, and halters alone could not. It was a human reminder of the love and care that had existed alongside the mistakes and losses. The caretaker spoke again, this time with a note of gentle admonition. "The property will always carry its memories. That's its nature. But now it knows you're different. You're not here to hide from it or to erase it. You're here to keep it alive in the right way." The words resonated, and he understood for the first time that the farm's secret had not been about something sinister in the usual sense. It had been about the weight of responsibility, about honoring lives that had been entrusted to the hands of those who had cared for them. The missing halters, the letters, the ledger, they were a test of respect, a way to measure whether someone was capable of understanding the delicate balance between care and oversight. Over the following days, he began the work of restoration. The barn was cleaned and repaired, pastures cleared, and fences mended. Horses that had been brought in from other rescues adjusted to their new home, and he took meticulous care to document their health, behavior, and progress. Each step was accompanied by reflections on the halters and the stories they represented, ensuring that history was acknowledged even as new life was nurtured. The land, once wild and untamed, began to feel like a sanctuary again, a space where past mistakes were remembered but not allowed to dominate the present. Visitors from the town began to trickle back, curious about the changes and the revival of the farm. Some came to see the horses, others to reconnect with the history of the property. He shared stories carefully, recounting memories preserved in the halters without revealing anything that would shame those who had come before. The property seemed to respond to the renewed life, with shadows softening in the barn and the quiet, almost imperceptible energy that had once made the place feel alive now felt warm and inviting. The halters, once a source of tension, had become symbols of resilience and memory. One afternoon, as he walked the pastures, he reflected on everything he had experienced. The property had challenged him, unsettled him, and demanded patience and attention. He had faced fear, isolation, and uncertainty, yet he had also uncovered stories of love, dedication, and care that had been nearly lost to time. The halters had revealed both the darkness and the light, and by acknowledging them fully, he had restored balance to the property. The abandoned horse rescue center was no longer a place of shadows and mystery. It was a living testament to the endurance of memory, compassion, and responsibility. The caretaker, now a steady presence once more, guided him through the process of archiving the halters, letters, and ledger entries. Each piece was carefully stored, cataloged, and displayed in a way that honored its history. He realized that the real secret of the property had never been hidden in the objects themselves, but in the respect and understanding they demanded. By embracing that responsibility, he had not only restored the farm, but had also grown into the kind of person who could steward its legacy responsibly. He spent quiet moments in the barn, holding the halters and tracing the names with his fingertips. Each one told a story, and together they formed a tapestry of the farm's life, stories of triumph and tragedy, care and neglect, mistakes and redemption. He understood now that history was not something to be erased or feared, but something to be remembered fully, even when it was difficult. The barn, once oppressive with its shadows and whispers, now felt like a place of peace, where memory and life coexisted. The town slowly embraced the farm once more. Families came to visit, volunteers helped with maintenance, and the rescue center grew into a hub of activity, teaching care and responsibility to anyone willing to listen. He shared the lessons of the halters and the history they represented without sensationalizing the darker aspects, helping others understand the importance of patience, attention, and respect when working with animals and land alike. The abandoned horse rescue center had become a symbol of restoration, a bridge between the past and the present, and a reminder that history, when honored, could guide and inspire. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the pastures in soft amber light, he stood by the pond, watching the reflection of the barn and the surrounding fields. The halters, now secured and respected, seemed to hum quietly in the corner of the barn, as though acknowledging the resolution he had brought to the property. The caretaker joined him, nodding toward the land. "It's finally at peace," he said. "The property has seen someone who understands. That's all it ever needed." He felt a deep sense of closure, a realization that the farm's story had been preserved, its lessons learned, and its secrets honored without being exploited. He returned to the barn one last time that evening, tracing his fingers along the rows of halters. Each name, each note, each mark told a story, and now those stories would endure, both in memory and in the restored farm. The missing halters had returned, the letters had been acknowledged, and the ledger had been preserved. The property, once heavy with silence and shadow, now breathed freely, a living archive of care, responsibility, and remembrance. He understood that his role was not just as owner, but as steward, a keeper of memory and protector of life. As night settled over the property, the barn doors closed with a gentle creak, the wind whispering softly through the pastures. He felt a quiet satisfaction, the culmination of weeks of tension, mystery, and discovery. The abandoned horse rescue center had revealed its secrets, tested his patience and courage, and allowed him to restore its dignity. He had walked through shadows and uncertainty, faced fear and isolation, and emerged with understanding, respect, and a renewed sense of purpose. The halters, now symbols of memory and redemption, hung in their corner, quiet witnesses to the lives that had shaped the property. The ledger, letters, and photographs were secured, telling a story that would not be forgotten. The caretaker remained, guiding where needed but no longer burdened by secrets. And in the soft moonlight spilling over the pastures, the property seemed alive in a new way, not with fear or mystery, but with life, respect, and the quiet power of remembrance. He took one last look around the barn, breathing deeply, and stepped outside. The field stretched before him, peaceful, the pond reflecting the calm sky. The abandoned horse rescue center was no longer abandoned, it had been reborn, its story preserved and honored. He understood, finally, that the darkest secrets were never truly meant to harm but to teach. And as he walked through the pastures, listening to the soft sounds of horses grazing, he felt a deep gratitude for the lessons of the halters, the property, and the lives that had passed through both. The story of the abandoned horse rescue center had come full circle. The conflicts had been acknowledged, the secrets revealed and respected, and the property had been restored to a place of balance and life. He knew the lessons of patience, care, and understanding would stay with him forever, guiding every step he took on the land that had once whispered secrets in the shadows. And as the barn settled into quiet stillness, the halters hanging gently in their corner, the property seemed to sigh, a final acknowledgement that the past had been honored and the future was now secure.